So we are in a series, if you've not been with us, called Holy Habits. Today's going to be a fun one. I need to start off by asking you this question. If there was a button that you could push, like it's readily available for you right now, I need to know how many of you would push the following button if this button would allow you the following or benefit you the following. It would give you a stronger faith. It would increase your contentment. It would grow your gratitude. It would increase your joy. It would deepen your friendship with Jesus. Perhaps if you're married, it might lead to greater marital harmony. If there was a way for you to push that button, how many of you would say, those of you online, those of you who were here, how many of you would say, I would push that button? This is a setup question. There are like 8 of you that trust me here, and I totally understand why, because there is a catch. And the catch is today we are talking about a holy habit that has the potential, that genuinely has the potential to do all of those things, but it is typically a habit that is associated with not feelings of blessing and goodness and fullness. It's a habit that we typically associate with anxiety and fear and compulsion and dread, especially when we talk about this in the context of the church. The habit we're talking about today is the habit of giving. Now, typically what I do in a message, kind of the way I lay out and structure a message, is I'll wait until the back end to sort of give you the punchline, and I'll lead gradually into it. But I'm going to do something different today, and here's what I want to do, just kind of ease anxiety. I want to let you know my goal on the front end, so you can all be aware. There's no sleight of hand, no trickery here. The goal is this, is to persuade you that giving is actually a good thing, that giving is in your best interest both now and in the future in eternity. The goal is to persuade you that if we look at the words of Jesus in just a moment, that giving is actually a blessing, not a burden. Now, I understand that right now we're in a setting where inflation is crazy. Property taxes, if any of you have gotten your property taxes, not fun. Going through that process of appealing to seeing how much they're going up. And so there are lots of challenges I understand and acknowledge, and we'll deal with some of those later. And here's kind of where we are generally as a church, not at Grace Chapel, but in broad terms. The statistics say this, that nationwide, somewhere between about 12 and 17% of people who are part of a local church do this thing called tithe. And we'll talk about in a moment what that actually is. It's giving a certain percentage or portion. But then on average, people who are part of a local church give somewhere between 1.5% to 2.5% of their income. So that's kind of the baseline. That's where we're starting. And one reason I'm pointing that out is to say that if you don't do that, the bar is set pretty low, and I'm not going to feel like I failed. I'm going to feel like you just weren't listening to God. That's a bit of an overstatement. But in general, this is a struggle. It is a challenge. But I believe this from the bottom of my heart. When we think about giving, if we understand what Jesus says about it, and this is really my appeal to you. If we understand what Jesus says about this topic of giving, it does have the potential for us to view it as a means to blessing, as pushing a button that leads to greater fullness, not greater anxiety, not greater dread, not greater, if I give, will I have enough? Giving is actually a way for us to be blessed. And so if you open with me to Matthew chapter 6, we're going to look at verse 2 as we begin. Then we're going to drop down and read and study from verses 19 through 24 in just a moment. As we begin, I want you to see how Jesus frames this topic of giving. In verse 2, he gives this phrase. He says, Matthew 6, verse 2, when you give. If you've been with us in this series, you know we've seen Jesus has also said, when you pray, when you fast. These were expectations that Jesus had. He just assumed that these were things that people were doing. And with regard to Jesus' teaching on money, you may be aware of this. 16 of the 38 of Jesus' parables had to do with the topic of mammon, which was this general word for possessions. We'll see this word in our passage we're going to study this morning. Roughly 1 in 10 verses out of the Gospels speak to this topic of mammon. Somebody has counted up, and they've said that 500 plus verses in the Bible deal with prayer. A little less than 500 deal with the topic of faith, but over 2,000 verses in the Bible deal with money. So Jesus spoke to this topic of money more than any other single one. The question is, why did he do that? And we're going to see this morning the reason he did that is because he knows that money can be an idol. And so as I communicate to you today, I just kind of bare bones, you're probably going to feel some inner resistance to what I'm saying. And I want you to not discount the potential of spiritual warfare, even as we talk about this topic, because this is a topic that Satan uses to create a wedge. He creates an idol in terms of people's relationship with God. Because when he removes our confidence and our trust in God, when we feel as if we can't trust him with our money, essentially what we're saying is we can't really fully trust him with our heart. And so when Jesus talked about the topic of money, and this is my heart as we go into this, the only time I'm aware that Jesus ever asked for money was when he used it as an illustration. This is so powerful to understand about Jesus. When Jesus went to people, he didn't want something from them. He wanted something for them. And it's the same with us. When we think about this topic of money, my goodness, we have all seen the abuses that have come from pulpits. We've seen the manipulation, if you'll give $100, God will give you 1,000. We've all seen that. And let me just say, that's garbage. I just don't think that that's in the heart of Jesus. And so as we look at this, hopefully we understand that Jesus, the driving force behind this message is he wants something good. He wants us to receive a blessing, not to view this as something that is a burden. And so let's dig in. Here's what Jesus has to say about this topic of money. In verse 19, he says this. He essentially says that there's 2 locations that we can send or invest our money. He says, verse 19, he says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. So that's the first location that we can send our finances. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Here's the reason why, is because he says, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But then he offers the contrast to this in verse 20, when he says, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. So Jesus doesn't have a problem with us storing up wealth. His concern is that the location where we store it doesn't need to be exclusively solely here on earth. He wants us to see that we can actually store up wealth in heaven. Here's why. He says, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. And so from this, we can kind of discern, Jesus is helping us see that we lose whatever we keep. So if we keep everything to ourselves, ultimately we lose it. Verse 19. Thieves break in and steal. All kinds of things can happen if we try to keep it. Ultimately we lose it on the day that we die, if not before then. But the opposite is also true. In the same way that we lose whatever we keep, here's the profound insight Jesus gives us. We keep whatever we give. Verse 21, or verse 20. He helps us to see that if we actually give things away, we're actually generous. We have the ability to keep that. As one writer I really appreciate, Randy Alcorn, says, he says, we can't take it with us, but we can send it on ahead. And so in verse 20, when he's saying, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, there is a permanence to that investment, a permanence to storing it up in heaven. And so when we look at verse 9, we ought to ask the question, why would Jesus encourage us to not store up our treasures on earth? Well, here's the reason, and I can say this confessionally, is because I think that's the best place for it to be stored. right? I mean, I think in myself, okay, I've got to figure out if I had a stack, and I don't know what your stack or how high it would need to be, but I have this inner belief somewhere that says if I could get a stack of dollars high enough, then I could feel at ease. Right? A stack of dollars high enough, then I could feel at peace. And really what this drives us to is discontentment. It drives us to lack of joy. It drives us to anxiety and stress. There was a number of years ago, PBS, they popularized a term called affluenza. They called it, this is years ago, they said it was a new American epidemic. They defined it as this. They said it is it's an unhappy and contagious condition of overload, debt, anxiety, and stress resulting from a dogged pursuit of more. They go on, and some symptoms of this disease. They said in the 1950s, the average size of a home was around 1,100 square feet. And this just gets convicting for all of us here in Douglas County. But he goes on and says in the 1970s, the average was 1,400 square feet. Going in the 1990s, around 2,000 square feet. And can you say out loud how large your homes are here today? No, we're not going to do that. But for all of us, we say, maybe that's the case. But typically, what we see locally in our area is probably 3,000 plus square feet. And so we have roughly 3 times as much space as we did some 60 years ago. But we still need more room. There is over a $20 billion per year industry called the storage industry. Some 2.2 billion square feet are contained in just storage. But here's the most ironic thing. The ironic thing is that since the 1950s, they've tracked this information here, the level of happiness that we have had, so if you kind of look at it on a graph, the level of space that we've had is going up, 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 up. But the level of happiness that we have has been going down, 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 down. So here's what we think, and hopefully you're honest enough to just admit this. We think that the quality of our life depends largely on the quantity of our possessions. Right? So if we're going to have a greater life, part of that, not all of it, but part of that includes having a greater quantity of possessions. And Jesus is pointing us here right from the very beginning. He's saying there are 2 directions, there are 2 paths that you can take with the location or the storage of your wealth. He's not against storing wealth. He just doesn't want us to hoard it here on this earth because he knows if we do, we burden ourselves, whereas if we give it and we send it on ahead, we actually open ourselves up to blessing. I think we see Ecclesiastes 5:10, the truth in these words, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. Proverbs 14:30 says, envy rots the bones. And so Jesus points us towards storing up our treasures, not on earth, but in heaven. There are essentially, I think, 2 pathways that we can take toward greater fulfillment, toward greater contentment. They are to either have the things that we want or want the things that we have. Now, if we take the path of saying, the way I'm going to get content, the way I'm going to feel fulfilled, is to have all the things that we want. Has anybody tried that before? I feel like we just need some open confession here today. I've tried that. We've all probably tried that before, to say, if I can just have all the things that I want, then I'll be at peace, then I'll be happy. The problem is that just leads to greater discontentment, leads to greater anxiety, leads to greater frustration, leads to overspending. Again, this belief that the quality of my life consists at least in part or depends in part on the quantity of my possessions. It leads us into this place of looking to money to do something that it never has promised to do or never can actually do for us. So we can take the approach that says, the way I'm going to find greater contentment is if I'll just have all the things that I want, then I'll be content. The problem is there's always something more that we want on the other side of getting the thing that we want that makes us think that we would be content if we got that thing. And it's a treadmill. It's a treadmill that never ends. So the other option would be to actually want the things that we have. To actually live with gratitude for maybe the house that's not exactly what we would want, or the car that has a few too many miles, or whatever it is, the wardrobe, or for men it's your hobby, whatever the thing is, that's the other option, is to actually live with gratitude for the things that we have as opposed to trying to have all the things that we want. When Jesus points us here toward storing up treasures in heaven, he frees us. He frees us to live in such a way that we try to manage not what we have, but what we want. I mean, years ago, I've shared this story. We lived in this place in Oklahoma where we were kind of up on a hill, and when we would go to take a shower, it was like there was terrible water pressure, and it was kind of like you just pouring out those little things that you would use in your lawn, in your yard, like a little container or something like that, trying to take a shower. And every time we go take a shower, it's like, this is terrible. Like, we're oppressed. This is a terrible circumstance, terrible thing. How can we live in such a world today that our water pressure is this bad? It's like first world problems, hello. And so that's one summer we were there, we took a trip to Mexico. And as we went over the border, we saw people who were going out and bathing in sewage. We saw people, living in these deplorable conditions in little shanty houses put together with little boards and pallets and, just terrible, terrible surroundings. When I went back to that home that had air conditioning, that home there in Oklahoma, all I had to do is turn on the water. It could be warm, it could be cold. It actually came out. It was sufficient to cleanse my body. It was a lot harder to focus on, here are the things that I want. It was a lot easier to focus on the things that I already had. It was a lot easier to have gratitude. And what giving does, and what's looking at storing up treasure in eternity does for us, it allows us to shift our focus, to shift our perspective from here's what we don't have, to here's what we do have. It unlocks for us generosity. And one of the things, and we'll go into the next verses in just a moment, but one of the things we tend to say with regard to giving is, if God would make me more generous, I would give. Right? Anybody think that before? Like, if I didn't have such fear over giving, I would give. If I didn't feel so much anxiety, if I wasn't crippled with this thought, will I have enough? If all those things weren't true, then I would give. And it's kind of like, use this illustration before, like if you went to a physical therapist and you had an injury and you said to the physical therapist, look, if my muscles would get stronger, then I would exercise. If my muscles would get stronger, then I would do the thing that you're wanting me to do. It's the same principle here, friends. If you say to God, or you say to Jesus, look, I would give if I just didn't have this fear, if I didn't have this anxiety that if I give, I'm not sure if there's going to be enough. Jesus would say just, no, it's in the giving that your faith grows. It's in the act, the decision, the habit of giving that your confidence in God's sufficiency can grow. And if you're saying, well, I'll wait, and God, you give me the confidence, then I'll give, he would say, no. You give first. The confidence, the faith comes with that. So those two things are wedded together, but we have to be people who are willing to give. Taking Jesus at his word, saying that we want to be people who live in such a way that we store up not just treasures on earth, knowing that those are going to waste away, we store up treasures in heaven. And so that he gets to in verse 21, what I believe is sort of the heart and the core. And if you don't get anything else, get what Jesus says in verse 21. He gives the reasoning for this when he says, remember, he's pointed us toward the future. Now in verse 21, he brings us right back to the present. Verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus sees that there is a connection between the location of your possessions and the location of your passion. There is a direct connection. We cannot say that I love God on this one hand, but all of my treasures indicate something totally different. And what we find from this is that money, it will do one of two things to us. It will either dull or it will deepen our friendship with Jesus. Money and the location of our treasure will either lead us to greater passion, greater love for Jesus, or less passion and less love for Jesus. And again, the thing I love about Jesus in his teaching about money is that he's concerned about our relationship to possessions because he's concerned about our relationship to him. God does not need our money. Jesus does not need our money. He is the God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I mean, he is an incredibly rich God. He could create wealth should he so desire. He does not need us to give. The reason Jesus expresses this as a concern is simply because he knows that money has a tendency to grab hold of our hearts. And I'd say that the real indicator, and you may not like me after I say this, and that's okay, but just give me grace, but let's dig into the truth here. The real indicator of whether or not God has your heart is whether or not he has your money. The words of Jesus are very clear. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so the truest thing we can understand about this is that a decision to store up for ourselves treasures on earth, a decision to not give, is a decision to allow money to be a wedge between you and your relationship with God. And I believe he would call us to view this as a window of opportunity, a window of growing in our faith, a window of growing in our understanding of God's provision, a window of growing in our experience of God's provision for us, not let it be a wedge. And so verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And he goes on in verses 22 and 23, he gives us what is really, I think, the perspective that we ought to have of giving. Now, when he gives these two verses, it seems as if on the front end that they have nothing to do with anything in this passage. But really, verses 19 through 24, there are three sets of contrasts. Verses 19 through 21, he's contrasting treasure on earth versus treasure in heaven. Verses 22 and 23, he's contrasting two types of eyes. And then in verse 24, he's going to contrast two masters. And so in verses 22 and 23, the contrast here, which speaks to the perspective that we ought to have, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And again, seems to have nothing to do with what he's talking about, but it really has everything to do with what he's talking about. He's teaching us here about the perspective that we have of money. If we have a perspective of money that says that the quality of my life depends on the quantity of my possessions, that the more money I get, the happier I will be. If we have a perspective that says, if I could just stack enough of these dollar bills up, then I would be okay. He says that is a darkened eye. That is a darkened perspective. Whereas if we have this perspective that says money is a means by which we live, it will not be a master to which we bow. God has given us this resource. It is a gift, and we can be grateful to Him for it, but it's not something that we're going to allow to be an idol in our life. It's not something that we're going to come to the place where we believe it has the power to make or break us. And let me say, for those of you who, if you're experiencing right now, today, in this season of your life, anxiety, stress, fear, worry, concern over finances, the first thing I would say is that Jesus knows that. And Jesus doesn't condemn you. Jesus knows your heart. He knows your concerns. He knows what's stirring inside of you. And He also knows not only the condition of your heart, but He knows how He can provide through your life as you trust Him. So there is this call here to continue to see finances through the lens of this eternal perspective, to view money as a means by which we live. It's not a master to which we bow. And then Jesus closes in verse 24 with, this is really kind of His call. If there's been any gray area, if you've said, well, yes, but, Jesus clarifies, and He draws us to this point, I believe, of decision in verse 24 when He says this. He says, no one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. And here is the takeaway, here is the punchline. You cannot serve both God and wealth. Now, here's my thinking, and perhaps this is yours as well. I can love money just a little, worry about money just a little. You know, I mean, there is wisdom, right? We look in the Proverbs, there is wisdom in having something stored up for the future. If we didn't store up anything for the future, a lot of you'd be living off your children, and that would be a bad way to go. And so there's wisdom. We understand this to being mindful about the future and preparing for the future. So Jesus is not calling us to this 100% dismissal of any wisdom where we never have anything stored up at all, but He's clearly calling us to a real black and white understanding that if money is somewhere in the realm of like our love, it's most likely an idol. And He would say to us that you can't have both as a master. You can't serve both. You have to serve one or the other. And here's the impact that money tends to have on us, is that love for money, it tends to reduce love for Jesus. This is the problem with money. Money itself is not a problem. Making money is not a problem. Being wealthy, not a problem. The problem is not when you have money. The problem is when money has you. The problem is when money occupies a space in our heart such that we trust more in it than we do in God. We trust more in our 401k than we do in our Creator. That's the problem with money. Money itself is a good thing. It's a blessing. I mean, we can understand that. But we have to own our money. Our money cannot own us. So from verse 24, we can see that money is to be used, not loved. God is to be loved, not used. One litmus test for us to determine whether or not money is an idol is, will we turn away from God if we lose money? We can see here that when we love money, we will use God. But when we love God, we will use money. And that's my prayer for us. We would understand we'll either love money and use God, or we will love God and use money. My prayer is that we would love God and we would use money. We could see that Jesus has given us a strategic opportunity to make the greatest investment. This is insider trading here. He's given us this strategic insight such that if we live according to what He has taught us, we have this permanent, eternal blessing that we can look forward to. So as opposed to seeing giving as a button that leads us to these fears and anxieties and stresses and worries and concerns, we could see giving as a way to blessing. Giving is a way to experiencing God's faithfulness in a way that we will never experience were we to keep everything that we have to ourselves. And so to apply this, it's pretty simple. I would point you toward, and this is what I believe in, I teach, and we seek to model in our lives. It's a principle called give, save, live. If you go to verse 33 of this chapter, chapter 6, Jesus will say, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. And all these other things, the things that we need to live, will be given to you as well. Jesus was teaching in Luke 12 on this topic of finances. He said, go, hey, sell some of your possessions, give to the poor. The teaching that Jesus gives is to put His kingdom first. Since we're on a roll with difficult sayings, we cannot put Jesus' kingdom first if we don't put Him first in our finances. We just can't do it. And so the approach would be that we say the first thing that we're going to do with the finances that God has entrusted to us is we're going to give. And I believe in this principle of tithing. It's a topic perhaps for another day and getting into the particulars of it. I don't believe that it is a New Testament command. I think that we find tithing in the Old Testament. But if you say, well, it's not a command, I don't really have to do it. So, yeah, okay. But my point in response to that would be this. Grace calls us to more, not less. We are under grace today, New Covenant. We've been given God's grace. This 10% law or rule, I think that's something we find within the Old Testament. But to argue that because we're now under grace, it calls us to less, not more, I think is a tough one to make. And I would just encourage you to examine that in your own heart and your own life as you think about what this needs to look like for you and for yourself individually or as a family. I think it's healthy to see 10% tithing kind of as the floor, not the ceiling. And if you're at a place where you say, oh my gosh, if I did that, I would be broke. I couldn't pay my bills. Then just understand God does give you grace. Again, the goal today is for you to leave in the same way that you want to commit to Scripture before phone, daily quiet time, prayer, resting, all those things, that you would commit today to say, you know what, I don't know at this point exactly how this is going to work out. I've got budgeting questions. I've got, all these questions, but I'm committing to this concept, this principle of I'm going to give, I'm going to save, and I'm going to live. And it may be a few months before we kind of get things in order, but what I do today is with Jesus and my relationship with Him, say I want to begin this habit. The good news, friends, and we see this from the teachings that Jesus gives us here, is frankly, He's just not interested in your money. I'm talking about money today. It's not because Jesus is interested in your money, He's interested in your heart. And I hope we all hear that. We don't walk away with this sense of burden. Oh no, the preacher said I need to do this. I don't know how I'm going to do this. I feel guilty. I feel terrible. The thing that Jesus is after is your heart. He's not concerned about your money. He blesses the size of your sacrifice, not the size of your gift. I mean, He's not concerned if you have $10 to give or $1,000 to give. He's not concerned about that. But the goal would be that you say, I want to be the kind of person who I give, save, and I live. I live off the rest. My hope would be, in kind of presenting this, communicating this today, is that when you get into heaven, if you've trusted in Christ, He's your Lord, He's your Savior, you've surrendered to Him, that when you get into heaven, you experience reward, not regret. Now, I understand it's a long way off. We don't normally think about living with this kind of eternal perspective. But the truth is, for every one of us who move into eternity, we are in Christ. We're going to spend eternity with Him. My personal prayer is that when you go into heaven, when you're there in the presence of Jesus, you live with a sense of reward and gratitude. That you sent on ahead that which you could not keep here on earth. You live with a sense of reward, not a sense of regret. And friends, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I would encourage you to begin somehow, some way, this holy habit of giving.